Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain.
What's up, guys? Today I'm going to be critiquing a video by Bart Ehrman arguing that the Gospels are not historically reliable. Let's go right ahead and get into the video.
Do the Gospels contain eyewitness tradition?
When I was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian, attending Moody Bible Institute, before I began my serious scholarship on the New Testament, before I began to read it in Greek, and before I saw what serious scholars of the world had to say about it, I was absolutely convinced that the Gospels not only contained eyewitness tradition, but that they were written by two eyewitnesses, Matthew and John, and by two people who were close companions to people who...
By the way, when he prefaces it by saying that it's before he learned what serious Bible scholars have to say, he's basically indicating that what he is about to give is what these serious Bible scholars have to say that he learned. So let's keep listening and see what is it that he learned that these serious Bible scholars have to say about the Bible.
Who were eyewitnesses? Mark and Luke. Intense research has a way of changing your mind about things. But I don't want you to think that this is a reason for you not to use your brain. Even if you are the most hardcore, Bible-believing evangelical on the planet, you surely think that God gave you a brain. Use your brain. Craig and I will agree on this.
That's very patronizing of him to say, even if you're an evangelical, use your brain, implying that evangelicals don't use their brains. I know some very intelligent evangelical Bible scholars, including those who have good education, such as from the University of Oxford, and I can tell you these people aren't morons. Maybe that's not the way he's intending for this to sound, but it's coming off as very pretentious.
God gave you a brain to think with. Apply reason. That's why God made you a human being instead of a slug. Don't be afraid of using your intelligence to find out the truth. The truth may not be what you were taught, but if it's true, you should believe it, not run from it. As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors.
Okay, so he's saying this as if it's an undisputed fact that the Gospels were originally anonymous. And for a while, I thought it was an undisputed fact because of the way that Bart Ehrman makes it sound. However, I eventually realized that many scholars disagree that the titles of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were added later. I emailed a New Testament scholar at the University of Cambridge named Peter Williams, and he told me that every single manuscript of the Gospels in existence has the names at the top, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Obviously, this doesn't apply to little fragments, where we only have a small portion from the middle of a Gospel. However, every manuscript we have where we can see the beginning of the Gospel has the names on them. There is no manuscript evidence that these names were added later. In fact, there are some very good scholars who argue that the Gospels are not actually anonymous. For example, Simon Gathercole, who was educated at Cambridge and then got his PhD at Durham University, has written 2 recent articles in which he argues that the Gospels are not anonymous, appealing to wide attestation of the Gospel titles in early Christianity. Likewise, a German historian of Second Temple Judaism, Martin Hingel, who got his PhD at University of Tübingen, argued that by the mid-2nd century, the 4 canonical Gospels were all known to have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He argues that the only way this could have happened, instead of finding alternate names suggested as the authors of the Gospels, would be if the church knew all along who had written the Gospels, and that the Gospels were never anonymous in the sense that no one knew who had written them. Likewise, Richard Bauckham, who also got his PhD at the University of Cambridge, has likewise argued that the Gospels were never truly anonymous. When talking about the Gospel of Matthew, he says, The title of the gospel, like all the gospel titles, was probably already attached to it when copies were first circulated, and that comes from his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Another scholar of the historical Jesus, Craig Evans, has said, "There are no anonymous copies of the Gospels, and there are no copies of the canonical Gospels under different names. Unless evidence to the contrary should surface, we should stop talking about anonymous Gospels and late unhistorical superscriptions and subscriptions." So, as I've pointed out, this is not to argue that everyone thinks the Gospels had their titles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, from the moment they were written. The majority of scholars do in fact take Bart Ehrman's position that the titles were added later, but the way that he is presenting this is as if it's a unanimous position among qualified experts, and it really isn't. There is new research continuing to come out that the Gospels are not anonymous. But let's get back into the video.
Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew.
When he says that Papias isn't referring to our Mark or our Matthew, that is certainly a minority position. Most scholars do think that Papias is referring to the Matthew and Mark that we have.
The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written.
Actually, that isn't true. There are a number of earlier sources that attribute the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As Simon Gathercole has pointed out in his article, The Alleged Anonymity of the Canonical Gospels, and you can see this right here. You see about midway down where it says Irenaeus against heresies. Well, all of the sources under that date to earlier than Irenaeus' writing, and you can see the little checks where it says the Gospels that are identified as coming from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So while it's true that we don't have any sources identifying Luke as the author of the third Gospel before Irenaeus, we do have sources identifying Matthew, Mark, and John as the respective authors of the other Gospels before Irenaeus. So his point he's making here isn't exactly true. And this comes from Simon Gathercole's article, The Alleged Anonymity of the Canonical Gospels. I'll put a link to the article in the description in case you want to read it. It's a very good read. But let's get back into the video.
My understanding of the Gospels as they've come down to us is that they were anonymous and we don't know their names, and they're not built on eyewitness testimony. But the important point that I want to make is that even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need law courts. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask somebody.
I don't think anyone is arguing that eyewitnesses are always 100% accurate. This is why I don't think it's a big deal if there are some minor discrepancies in the Gospels. As Bart Ehrman pointed out, this is what we expect from eyewitnesses because they aren't always 100% accurate. But I don't think anyone should go to the other extreme and say that eyewitnesses are never reliable. In fact, eyewitnesses are used all the time in our justice system because our legal system does think that eyewitness testimony is valuable.
Eyewitnesses do not always get all the information right. But even if they did, it wouldn't matter because the Gospels of the New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and in fact they were not written by eyewitnesses. The gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country decades later. Where did they...
I don't know why he's saying that these Gospel writers were writing in a different country. I don't think anyone knows for sure where the Gospels were written, and many scholars have argued that they were written in Judea. For one quick example, I was just reading about Gerhard Thiessen, a prominent New Testament scholar, and his view is that the Passion narrative in the Gospel of Mark comes from the same local area because of how the author leaves some names of the characters anonymous in order to protect their identities from, protect them from getting into trouble. For example, the name of the man who cut off the ear of the priest's slave in Mark is left anonymous because revealing his identity could get him into big trouble. But this only makes sense if the gospel were written in the same general area where revealing the man's identity would get him into trouble. This is just one of countless arguments people use when trying to figure out where the gospels are written. But Ehrman confidently says that they were written in a different country as if it's a known fact, and as if this, if it were true, somehow discredits the reliability of the gospels. Let's keep going.
They get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language.
I don't see how the fact that the Gospels were written in a different language, Greek, means they aren't historically reliable. Yes, it does mean that they are translating the words of Jesus from Aramaic to Greek, and I do agree that meaning and nuance is lost when you translate someone's words. But what about the stories? Obviously, when you're writing down an event, it doesn't matter what language you write it in. The fact that the Gospels were written in Greek does not make them unreliable.
Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories.
There he goes again with the different country and different language argument.
What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories.
What Ehrman is describing here is the view that the Gospels originally passed down as anonymous oral traditions for decades by word of mouth without any controls to ensure that they retained their reliability. In another video, I've heard Bart Ehrman compare it to the game of telephone. However, there is one important thing that Bart Ehrman isn't taking into account. In the game of telephone, you can't pause the game and ask the original person to clarify what they said. If you did, then you would always you would never get a different result because people would be able to fact check and make sure that they were passing on the correct message from one person to the next. Eyewitnesses of Jesus were still around at the time that the Gospels were written. Even if you don't think the Gospels were written by the people in their titles, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's a known fact that many eyewitnesses of Jesus continued to remain in Jerusalem and spread the teachings of Jesus to all who would listen. People would travel from all around and go to Jerusalem for Jewish feasts and holidays. Anyone who was interested could stop by and listen to Peter or get clarification on a story about Jesus that he or she had heard. In fact, in Galatians, Paul talks about how he did this very thing. In Galatians 1, Paul talks about how he traveled to Jerusalem and met with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, to make sure that he was teaching the correct gospel message. With the eyewitnesses fact-checking the stories that were being preached, any stories that differed dramatically from the truth would likely not make it very far. But Bart Ehrman is reciting the old view of the form critics. As scholar Vincent Taylor once said, "If the form critics are right, the disciples must have been translated to heaven immediately after the resurrection." This means that the form critics failed to account for the fact that there were living guarantors of the stories about Jesus. They were not passed down anonymously like the game of telephone. In fact, we actually have writings of early Christians talking about how they received their oral traditions about Jesus. Interestingly, they make it clear that they are not blindly accepting any tradition that they hear. Instead, they specifically want traditions that are linked to the eyewitnesses. One example comes from one of our earliest Christian writers outside the New Testament who was alive while some of the eyewitnesses were still alive. His name is Papias, and let me just read what he says about how he would seek for information from oral stories. He said, "If by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders. That is, what, according to the elders, Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice." So he is not just accepting any story that anyone tells him that's being passed down anonymously. He specifically wants to hear stories going back to the eyewitnesses. The same is true of Irenaeus with Polycarp. Irenaeus personally knew Polycarp, who personally knew some of the eyewitnesses. Irenaeus writes about how he would seek for oral traditions about Jesus. He says, "For I distinctly recall the events of that time better than those of recent years, for what we learn in childhood keeps pace with the growing mind and becomes part of it, so that I can tell the very place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit as he discoursed, his goings out and his comings in, the character of his life, his bodily appearance, the discourses he would address to the multitude, how he would tell of his conversations with John and with the others who had seen the Lord, how he would relate their words from memory, and what the things were which he had heard from them concerning the Lord, his mighty works, and his teaching. Polycarp, as having received them from the eyewitnesses of the life of the Logos, would declare in accordance with the scriptures." So this is another example of someone who is not accepting anonymous oral traditions, but eagerly listening to traditions that are linked to key eyewitnesses. The picture we get from the earliest Christians is that they were not interested in anonymous oral traditions. Instead, they were interested in stories that they could trace back to the earliest eyewitnesses. The Gospels are not the product of anything like the game of telephone. Also, in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, the author starts by saying that he is getting his information directly from eyewitnesses. So even the authors of the Gospels are not just blindly accepting anonymous oral traditions, but they want traditions that go back to key eyewitnesses. So Bart Ehrman's view is not exactly correct when he says that the Gospels are stories that have been told and retold with no sort of control over the telling of the stories. If you like this video, please subscribe and comment any questions that you have down below, like the video, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you then.